5 days after my eye surgery, still wearing a bandage over my left eye and squinting through the blur in my right, I heard the front door open. And then another, and another, until our living room filled with voices I recognized, but couldn't clearly see. 20 of my husband's relatives, all at once, on a Tuesday afternoon I'd been told would be quiet. Everyone wanted to come see how you're healing, Derek said, guiding me by the elbow toward the couch, the way you'd guide someone much older, much frailer than I actually was. I let him, because my depth perception was still unreliable, and the room was a blur of shapes and familiar voices, aunts and cousins, and his mother, all talking over each other. Someone setting a casserole dish down on the kitchen counter. Someone else asking whether I could see well enough to hug them hello. I recognized voices before faces. Derek's mother's particular warm cadence. His cousin Whitney's quick laugh. The low, steady voice of his Aunt Carol somewhere near the doorway. I counted heads the best I could through the blur and lost track somewhere past 15, unable to shake the strange, floating sense that I'd woken up into the wrong afternoon entirely. I didn't understand, not yet, why 20 people had chosen that particular Tuesday. 5 days after a surgery Derek himself had described to his family as nothing serious, just a quick procedure, to descend on our house all at once. I understood a few minutes later, when I heard a stranger's voice among the familiar ones, brisk and professional, introducing herself as a notary, and heard the particular rustle of a thick stack of papers being set on the coffee table in front of me. I know it's a lot at once, Derek said, crouching down beside me, his voice pitched low and gentle in a way that, 5 days earlier, before any of this, I would have simply called kind. But everyone's here, and Marjorie can only do the notarization today, and I really think it's better if we just get this handled while your mom's family's all together for support. I'll read it to you. You just need to sign where I show you. Your eyes are still healing, you don't need to strain them on the fine print. My name is Claire Whitmore. I was 43 years old, half blind from a surgery that had gone exactly as planned, when I understood, with a slow, cold clarity that cut through even the blur in my vision, that the 20 people filling my living room hadn't come to see how I was healing at all. They had come to watch me sign something. If I had signed where he pointed, my father's house would have carried a $180,000 loan before I could even read the first page. I'd spent 18 years as an operating room nurse. By then, a career built on exactly the kind of steady, careful attention that makes it easy to overlook the same qualities missing from the rest of your own life. I was good at staying calm in emergencies, good at reading a room full of tension and knowing exactly what needed to happen next. Good, apparently, at everything except recognizing the particular emergency quietly assembling itself in my own living room. I'd had cataract surgery on my left eye the week before, a procedure so routine my own surgical team joked about it during my prep, the same kind of surgery I'd assisted with dozens of times myself over 18 years as an operating room nurse. My vision was expected to be blurry and light-sensitive for another week. Nothing more serious than that, though Derek had spent the days since my surgery describing my condition to his family. I would later learn, in noticeably graver terms, still pretty out of it, not really up to reading things closely, needs a lot of help right now. The house we were sitting in had been my father's before it was mine. He'd built it with his own hands over 4 summers in the early 90s, on land that had been in my mother's family for 2 generations before that, and when he died 11 years ago, he left it to me outright. My name and mine alone on the deed, a fact I'd always been quietly proud of and had never once thought to hide from Derek, because for the first 10 years of our marriage, hiding anything from him had never once occurred to me. Derek and I met when I was 29. Already established in my nursing career, him 3 years into a sales role at a medical device company that would, over the following decade, promote him steadily upward until he was managing an entire regional territory. He was charming in the specific way salespeople often are, attentive without being overbearing, the kind of man who remembered small details from a first conversation and brought them up again weeks later, making you feel, each time, genuinely seen. We married 2 years later, in the backyard of the house that would eventually become entirely mine. My father walking me the 20 feet from the back porch, to where Derek stood waiting, both of us laughing at how short the aisle actually was. My father died 11 years ago, quickly, of a heart attack that gave none of us any warning, and left the house to me outright in a simple one-page will he'd apparently updated the year Derek and I married, my name and mine alone on the deed. I remember Derek, at the reading, squeezing my hand and saying he was glad the house would always be mine, no matter what happened to us, a sentiment I'd taken, at the time, as pure and uncomplicated love, rather than anything worth examining more closely. For most of our marriage, the division of labor between us felt natural rather than imposed. My surgical schedule was demanding and unpredictable. 12-hour shifts, on-call rotations, weeks where I barely saw daylight outside an operating room. Derek's sales job, by comparison, ran on a calendar he could plan around, and somewhere in our first 5 years together, he simply became the one who handled the household's paperwork. The mortgage on the property tax side of things, the insurance renewals, the utility disputes, the accountant's annual visit. I signed what he put in front of me, trusting him the way you trust a partner you've built an entire life alongside, and for a long time, that trust cost me nothing at all. That began to change, quietly, about 2 years ago. Derek's regional sales numbers had been strong for most of his career, but a company restructuring cost him two of his largest accounts within the same year, and though he never used the word struggling out loud, I noticed the small signs of a man managing something he didn't want, examined too closely. He started taking calls in the garage with the door shut, a credit card statement I glimpsed once, before he folded it into his jacket pocket, showed a balance higher than any I remembered us carrying. He mentioned, more than once, a business opportunity a old college friend named Trevor had brought to him. Something involving a boutique fitness franchise. Trevor was trying to expand, though every time I asked for specifics, Derek changed the subject with the easy deflection of someone who'd rehearsed the redirection in advance. There was a Sunday dinner, about 4 months before my surgery, when Derek's father asked, over dessert, how the fitness franchise investment was coming along. And Derek answered smoothly, at length, describing projected returns and expansion timelines with the fluent confidence of a man who had clearly given this exact speech before, to this exact table, more than once. I remember sitting there, nodding along, realizing only much later that I had never once been part of the conversations that speech was clearly built from. 6 months before my surgery, I found a real estate agent's business card in the pocket of a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaners, behind a receipt for a lunch meeting at a restaurant, across town from Derek's usual sales territory. I stood in the laundry room, holding it for a long moment, turning it over, and then I did what I'd apparently trained myself to do, without ever noticing the training. I put it back exactly where I'd found it, told myself real estate agents sometimes handled all kinds of unrelated business, and said nothing. The morning of my surgery, Derek was unusually attentive, driving me to the outpatient center himself, holding my hand in the waiting room, telling me not to worry about anything at home, that he'd take care of everything while I recovered. I remember feeling grateful for it at the time, the particular gratitude of someone who has spent 18 years married to a person and has simply stopped questioning why kindness sometimes arrives with unusual timing. Back in the living room, 5 days after surgery, Derek had already begun reading from the papers on the coffee table, his voice smooth and unhurried, the practiced cadence of a man who had rehearsed this exact reading more than once. It's mostly just standard language. He was saying, giving me temporary authority to handle a few financial decisions while you're recovering, so I don't have to keep bothering you with paperwork. You can't really see clearly right now anyway. Marjorie just needs your signature here and here. I could make out the shape of the papers in front of me, dense blocks of text swimming slightly in my still recovering vision, and I understood, in the particular way you understand something with your body before your mind fully catches up, that I could not actually read a single word of what I was being asked to sign. Can someone read the whole thing out loud? I said, keeping my voice light, conversational, just so I know what I'm agreeing to. I'd feel silly, signing something I couldn't see. Of course, Derek said, a beat too quickly, that's exactly what I'm doing, and continued in the same smooth, summarizing tone, skipping. I would later learn. Entire paragraphs that had nothing to do with temporary bill pay authority at all. It was Derek's Aunt Carol who reached me first, cutting through the crowded living room with the particular urgency of someone who has decided, mid-conversation, that she can no longer stay quiet. Carol had never been especially close to Derek. She was his father's older sister, a retired paralegal who'd spent 30 years reviewing exactly this kind of document for a living, and she had always treated me with a warmth that felt entirely separate from whatever she thought of her nephew. "Claire, honey, can I get you some water in the kitchen?" she said, already taking my arm. Her voice pitched for the room, but her grip firm and purposeful in a way that made clear. This wasn't really about water at all. She walked me slowly toward the kitchen, out of earshot of the living room's noise. And once we were alone by the sink, her voice dropped to something quieter, more urgent. "Claire, I don't think you should sign anything today." I was in the driveway 20 minutes before everyone came in, on the phone with my sister, and Derek was out there too, on his own call. I wasn't trying to listen, but he wasn't exactly being quiet. He was talking to someone about a mortgage broker, saying something about needing her signature today, while everyone's there to keep things smooth. Honey, that's not bill pay language. That's not a man asking his recovering wife to help manage the electric bill. I stood in my own kitchen, blurred light from the window behind Carol's silhouette, and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the particular stillness that arrives right before you understand you're about to have to be far more alert than your body currently wants to let you be. "Thank you for telling me," I said, and meant it more than I think I'd ever meant anything in that kitchen before. I walked back into the living room with a glass of water I never drank, and I did the only thing I could think to do in that moment, surrounded by 20 people and a notary and a husband who had clearly planned this afternoon with more care than he'd planned most of our anniversaries. I laughed softly, apologetically, and pressed my good hand to my temple. "I'm so sorry, everyone. I think the pain medication is catching up with me," I said. "I'm getting a headache just trying to focus on the page. Derek, can we do this next week, once my eyes have actually healed enough that I can read it myself? I don't want to sign anything I can't see clearly, even if it's just routine." There was a small, uncomfortable pause. Derek's smile tightening at the edges in a way I recognized from 18 years of watching him manage disappointment in front of an audience. His mother, standing near the fireplace, said quickly, too quickly, "Of course, honey. Take all the time you need." And I understood, watching her face, that whatever Derek had told his family about this afternoon, none of them had been let in on the actual stakes. "Of course," Derek said, too smoothly. "No rush at all. Whenever you're ready." Marjorie the notary packed her papers back into a leather folder with the practiced neutrality of someone who had clearly witnessed families in far worse moments than this one, and the room slowly reabsorbed into casserole dishes and small talk. 20 relatives none the wiser that anything unusual had just been quietly avoided. I called a family law attorney the following morning, a woman named Ines Delgado, whose name I found through a nurse colleague who'd gone through her own difficult divorce 2 years earlier. I brought Ines everything I could gather in the days that followed, working carefully, quietly, my vision improving daily, even as the situation itself grew murkier. The first thing I found was in an email account Derek had set up years earlier, Pulse Households, one I still technically had access to, but rarely checked. Buried among utility notices was a message from a mortgage broker, dated 3 weeks before my surgery, confirming a home equity application against our property. My property, for a loan of $180,000, the application listing Derek as sole applicant, despite the deed carrying only my name. The broker's email noted, almost as an afterthought, that a co-owner's signature and notarized authorization would be required before the loan could close, a requirement Derek had apparently been working, quite literally, to schedule around. I sat at my kitchen table reading that email 3 times, the same table where Derek had once told me, at my father's will reading, how glad he was that the house would always be mine. The second thing came from Ines herself, 3 days later, after she'd done some quiet digging of her own. The business opportunity Derek had mentioned so vaguely for months, the fitness franchise expansion with his old friend Trevor, was in significantly worse financial shape than Derek had let on. Trevor's existing two locations were both behind on rent, one facing eviction proceedings that were a matter of public record. The $180,000 wasn't going towards some promising new investment. It was going to keep Trevor's failing business alive for another year, propped up by equity, in a house that had been my father's before Derek had ever set foot in it. I thought of every Sunday dinner where Derek had mentioned Trevor's exciting expansion plans, with the easy confidence of a man discussing a sure thing, and felt something in me go quietly, permanently colder toward him. The third thing I learned almost by accident, at a cousin's baby shower, 2 weeks after the living room incident, when Derek's younger cousin Whitney mentioned, entirely without malice, that she was so glad Claire was on board with helping Derek and Trevor out. That's really generous of you, considering it's your house and everything. I smiled and said something non-committal, my stomach tightening, and asked, as lightly as I could manage, where she'd heard that. Derek mentioned it at Thanksgiving, she said, reaching for another petit four, entirely unaware of what she was handing me. Said you two had already talked it through and you were happy to help family. We had never talked it through. I had never once heard Trevor's name attached to any request for money. Until that living room, 5 days after surgery, with 20 witnesses, assembled to make refusal feel unthinkable. I drove home from that baby shower gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, replaying every Thanksgiving dinner from the past year, wondering how many other rooms I hadn't been in, while Derek quietly built a version of our marriage that made his plans sound like mine. Innes reviewed everything at our second meeting, the loan application, the eviction filing on Trevor's business, Whitney's comment about Thanksgiving, and set her pen down with the particular calm of someone who has seen this exact pattern more times than she could count. Claire, the deed is solely in your name, which is the strongest possible position you could be in here. No lender can finalize a home equity loan against sole owner property without your actual signature and independent notarization. Meaning Tuesday's living room performance wasn't paperwork, it was theater, designed to get that signature through social pressure rather than legal process, because Derek didn't have any other way to get it. My recommendation is that we file a formal notice with the county recorder's office today, flagging the property against any unauthorized encumbrance, and that you request written confirmation from the mortgage broker that no application can proceed without your direct, independently notarized consent. I thought of my father's hands, steady on a hammer, framing this house board by board over 4 long summers, and something in me settled, quiet and certain, the way it hadn't since that Tuesday afternoon. Do it, I said. Today, she did. The notice went on record within the week, and Ines sent formal correspondence to the mortgage broker's office confirming that any application involving the property required Claire Whitmore's direct, witnessed consent. Consent that had, notably, never actually been given, whatever Derek had told his family or his broker to the contrary. Ines also asked me, near the end of that second meeting, a question I hadn't fully let myself sit with yet. Claire, I have to ask, 'cause it matters for how we handle everything going forward. Do you want to stay married to him, if this gets resolved cleanly, or is this already something else for you? I sat with that question longer than I expected to, staring at the framed photo of my father on Enos's bookshelf, a stranger's office holding the same steady gaze he used to give me from across our own kitchen table. I think I already know the answer, I finally said. I think I've known it since the moment I realized 20 people were in my living room to watch me sign something instead of to see how I was healing. Ines nodded, unsurprised, and made a note in the margin of her legal pad that I couldn't quite read and didn't ask her to explain. I didn't confront Derek during those 2 weeks. I let him believe the delay was simply about healing eyes and post-surgical fatigue, watched him grow visibly more anxious as days passed, without the follow-up signing he'd clearly expected to happen quickly, and said nothing, because I had learned, finally, the value of gathering the truth fully before I ever spoke it out loud. Derek mentioned, 10 days after the living room afternoon, that Marjorie the notary was available again the following Sunday. And that everyone's already planning to come back anyway, for Aunt Carol's birthday, so it'll be easy to just finish up the paperwork while we're all together. I recognized the strategy immediately for what it was. The same 20 witnesses, the same social pressure, dressed this time as a birthday party. I told him that sounded lovely and asked whether I should order the cake. I spent the days leading up to that Sunday quietly preparing in ways Derek had no reason to suspect. I met with Ines twice more, confirming exactly what documentation I'd need on hand, rehearsing, almost like a surgical checklist, the precise sequence of what I intended to say, and in what order, because I had learned enough, over 18 years in operating rooms, to know that even the most difficult moments go easier when you've walked through them in your head beforehand. I picked up the cake myself, a lemon layer cake Carol had always loved, and drove home with it, balanced carefully in the passenger seat, thinking, the entire way, about how strange it was to be preparing so meticulously for a birthday party that had almost nothing to do with anyone's birthday at all. Aunt Carol's birthday arrived on a bright Sunday afternoon, the same living room filling once again, with the same 20 relatives, the same casserole dishes, the same practiced warmth from Derek as he moved through the room accepting compliments on the party he'd organized. I stood near the kitchen doorway for a moment before joining everyone, watching him laugh easily with his mother, refill someone's coffee, ask his father about a golf game, an entire performance of ordinary family life, playing out over a plan he believed was still on schedule beneath it. Marjorie the notary arrived precisely at 3, exactly as scheduled, her leather folder tucked under her arm, and I watched Derek's shoulders relax slightly at the sight of her, a man confident the afternoon was finally going to close the way he'd planned it weeks earlier. "Claire, why don't we get this handled before we cut the cake?" Derek said, guiding me toward the coffee table with the same gentle, practiced hand from 2 weeks earlier. The papers already waiting, already open to the signature page. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across a room that quieted almost immediately, 20 conversations trailing off as people turned toward the coffee table. "I'd like everyone to hear what this document actually says before anyone signs anything. Aunt Carol, would you mind reading it aloud? You spent 30 years reading contracts like this one for a living, and I trust your eyes far more than I trust a summary right now." Derek's smile flickered, just slightly, at the edges. "Claire, that's really not necessary. I've already gone through it with you." "I'd like to hear it in full," I said, keeping my tone light, pleasant, the tone of a woman making a perfectly reasonable request at her own birthday-adjacent gathering. "In front of everyone who's here to support us." Carol picked up the document without hesitation, adjusting her reading glasses, and began reading aloud in the clear, precise voice of someone who had spent 3 decades doing exactly this professionally. The room, moments earlier, full of easy chatter and clinking forks, went quiet in stages, first near the coffee table, then rippling outward toward the kitchen doorway, until every conversation in the house had folded itself into silence around Carol's steady, unhurried reading. The room's easy warmth curdled within about 90 seconds, as words like home equity line, sole collateral, and $180,000 landed one after another into a silence that had, moments earlier, been full of birthday chatter. "This isn't a bill pay authorization," Carol said, looking up from the page, first at me, then, more slowly, at her nephew. "Derek, this is a full mortgage application against Claire's house, her house, with her as sole collateral and you as sole applicant." She set the papers down on the coffee table with a small, deliberate click. "I told you I overheard your phone call 2 weeks ago. I didn't realize, until just now, reading this myself, exactly how much you'd left out of what you told the rest of us this was for." "It's for Trevor's business," Whitney said slowly, into the widening silence, looking between Carol and Derek with the dawning discomfort of someone realizing she'd repeated something untrue at a baby shower 2 weeks earlier. "You told me Claire already knew all about it." "She didn't," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I found out about the loan application, and about Trevor's business, and about the eviction his other locations are already facing, entirely on my own, after that first Tuesday. I have a formal notice on record, with the county preventing this loan from closing without my independent notarized consent, which I have never given and don't intend to give today either." I let that settle a moment before continuing. "5 days after surgery, half blind, surrounded by 20 people who love you, is not consent, Derek. It's an ambush with a cake at the end. Derek's face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then something closer to panic, then a flattened, cornered kind of anger he was visibly working to keep contained in front of 20 relatives. Claire, we can talk about this privately. We tried that Tuesday, in front of everyone you invited, I said. I think it's fair that the same everyone hears the rest of it now. Marjorie the notary quietly closed her leather folder without being asked, the particular tact of a professional who has recognized, correctly, that no signature was happening in that living room that day. The fallout moved quickly once the truth was sitting out in the open, in a living room full of people who could no longer pretend not to have heard it. The mortgage broker's office sent a formal letter within days, addressed to both our names, declining to proceed with the application entirely, citing an unresolved consent discrepancy flagged by the county recorder's office. A bloodless, bureaucratic sentence that nonetheless closed the door Derek had spent months trying to quietly open. Trevor called Derek's cell phone twice that same week, and the second time, at Sunday dinner 2 weeks after the birthday party, Derek made the mistake of answering it at the table, forgetting to step outside first. The whole table heard Trevor's voice, tinny and desperate through the speaker, before Derek could silence it, demanding to know where the money was, reminding Derek he'd promised this weeks ago, while Derek's mother set down her fork and stared at her son with an expression I recognized, because I'd been wearing some version of it myself for months. Trevor's fitness franchise, already behind on rent at both locations, entered formal eviction proceedings within the month regardless, the emergency capital he'd been counting on never materializing at all. Derek's company, when a routine background review turned up the recorded county notice against our property during an unrelated refinancing inquiry. Derek had also apparently attempted, through his own workplace credit union, flagged it as a conflict with their employee financial conduct policy, and Derek was quietly moved off 2 accounts he'd been managing. A professional demotion in every sense but title, a regional sales director job he'd been angling for since spring, one he'd all but promised himself over dinner more than once. Went to a colleague instead, the promotion committee reportedly uneasy, according to someone who mentioned it to Carol, about some personal financial complications that had come up during his review. Carol stopped attending Sunday dinners at Derek's mother's house for nearly 2 months afterward, a rift that, as far as I know, never fully healed, though she called me every week without fail, checking in, telling me once, simply, "You did the right thing, and I'm sorry it took me overhearing a driveway phone call to help you see it sooner." Whitney sent me a long, apologetic text a few days later, mortified at having repeated Derek's version of events at her own baby shower, which I told her, honestly, wasn't her fault to carry. She came by the house herself a few weeks after that, unannounced, with a small potted plant and an expression somewhere between guilt and determination. "I keep thinking about what I said," she told me, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I should have asked you directly instead of just repeating what he told me. I'm sorry." I invited her in for tea, and we talked for over an hour, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, grateful for the honesty, rather than resentful of the delay in offering it. I filed for divorce 6 weeks after Carol's birthday. The county notice Enos had filed made the property division straightforward in a way I hadn't expected. The house was unambiguously mine, always had been, and Derek's attorney advised him, apparently, against contesting something, with that much daylight already between it and any reasonable claim. There was a brief dispute over the modest retirement accounts we'd both contributed to over the years, and an even briefer one over a car neither of us particularly wanted, but nothing that came close to the drawn-out battle I'd braced myself for in the weeks after that birthday party. We finalized everything by early autumn, faster and quieter than I'd braced myself for. A single afternoon in a courthouse hallway that felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had led up to it. Derek came by the house once, near the end of the process, to collect the last of his things from the garage. We stood in the driveway afterward for a moment, the same driveway Carol had overheard him on the phone in months earlier, and he said, quietly, "I never meant for it to feel like an ambush." I just thought if everyone was there, it would feel less like asking you for something big and more like a family thing. It was never going to be a family thing, Derek, I said. It was always going to be my signature on my father's house for a loan I never agreed to. 20 people in the room didn't change what it actually was. It just made it harder for me to say no out loud. He didn't have an answer for that, and after a moment, he got in his car and left. And that was, as far as I know, the last real conversation we ever had. I still live in the house my father built, the deed exactly where it's always been, my name and mine alone. I went back to work in the operating room 8 weeks after my surgery, my vision fully recovered, sharper, if anything, than it had been before any of this started. My charge nurse, Denise, who'd worked beside me for over a decade and had heard a condensed version of the story through the hospital's small, efficient grapevine, hugged me tightly on my first morning back and said, "Only you would come out of eye surgery seeing more clearly than the rest of us." I laughed, for what felt like the first time in months, and meant it. I repainted the living room that fall, a soft, pale green I'd wanted for years and never quite gotten around to, and every time I sit on that couch now, I think, with a small private satisfaction, of exactly whose signature was never on anything in this house except my own. Carol helped me pick the paint color, actually. Standing in the aisle of the hardware store, holding up two nearly identical swatches, telling me, with the particular bluntness I'd come to love about her, "Whatever you choose it because you like it, not because it's what someone else would have picked for you." I think about that piece of advice more often than she probably intended it. I think about that Tuesday afternoon often, 20 relatives filling my living room, under the guise of a welcome home visit, and I don't regret the moment I laughed off a headache and asked for one more week. I think sometimes the bravest thing you can do, when you can't yet see clearly, is simply refuse to sign anything until you can. I think, too, about the real estate agent's card I found in Derek's jacket pocket 6 months before any of this, the one I folded back exactly as I'd found it, and never mentioned. I've made a kind of peace with that silence, the same way I've made peace with every other moment I chose not to ask a hard question when it would have been easier not to know the answer. I wasn't foolish for staying quiet. I was a woman who had built an entire career on trusting the people beside her to do their part competently. And it took 20 relatives in my living room to teach me that trust, at home, has to be earned the same way it's earned in an operating room. Continuously, not just once. At the very beginning, and never checked again. If you've ever felt a room quietly closing in around a decision you weren't ready to make, I hope you remember this. You're always allowed to ask for more time, even when 20 people are watching, even when the paperwork is already open on the table in front of you. Clarity is worth waiting for, no matter how inconvenient the timing looks to everyone else in the room. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has anyone ever tried to rush you into a decision using a room full of people instead of an honest conversation? Leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. We share stories like this one every day. Stories about quiet strength, clear eyes, and the moment someone finally refuses to sign away what's rightfully theirs. If you'd like to be part of that journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember that you're always allowed to ask to read the fine print first.